Hey y'all, welcome back to CFB Picks. We got another Penn State matchup we're breaking down this week versus the Central Michigan Chippewas. If you like what you saw in the first two videos, please like and subscribe. In the meantime, though, we're going to discuss last week's shortcoming in the prediction. My pick was 27-20, and the model had a 3.02 spread. The final ended up being 41-12. So we're going to discuss why the model was so far off in this case. So one of the defining statistics in that game was the turnover margin, which Penn State won by turning the ball over 0 times to Auburn's 4. And that definitely had an impact on this game, if not determined, why the spread was so far off. I think if these two teams were to play each other 10 times, the spread would look a lot closer to 3 or 7. As I picked it, it really seemed like after those turnovers, Auburn had to change at quarterback, went with more of a run-heavy game, which I voiced my concerns with last week that, I think the way to beat this Penn State team is to pass and not just run the ball, despite Purdue having some success with that early. So moreover, on the point with turnovers, this model, I make the choice to not include turnovers specifically in the scores that are generated. There are other inputs in the model that are affected by how much a team turns the ball over, but I make that decision not to have a specific category for turnovers just because, football, the ball's oddly shaped compared to some other sports. It's going to come out of people's hands sometimes, or you're going to have a quarterback who has a bad day and turns the ball over through the air a few times. It's, in my opinion, nearly impossible to model, so I choose not to. That's why I think if these two teams played again, the score would be a lot, closer to 3 or 7. Moving on to this coming week, Central Michigan last week played Bucknell out of the FCS program, or division rather. Had a big win there. It's also important to note that Bucknell is not a particularly strong FCS team. But that being said, Central Michigan's put up some good games this year. They kept the score close, largely in garbage time with Oklahoma State, which we'll dive into in a little bit here. Meanwhile, Penn State had their dominant showing against Auburn. That was, largely guided by turnovers. But I think this Penn State team is improving nonetheless. Auburn, usually they have a pretty strong program there, and I think that if these two teams were to play again, it would be closer to a one-score game. So getting onto the PSU side of things, like I said, they had a dominant performance, but I think the model really saw that, Auburn hadn't really played anyone, and that even the games they had played, especially in the one against San Jose State, their defense was not particularly great. I mean, holding a team to 16 points is pretty good, but putting up 24 on a team that's, in more or less the bottom third to bottom quarter of FBS isn't impressive, and the model really saw that. That's why, I was really kind of hinting towards that, if you're going to bet on the spread, you probably want to bet above 3. The model picked that up. My pick also reflected that, largely due to that strength of schedule, just because it is pretty hard to predict at this time of the year. 3 games in, you don't really know who's good and who's bad, so that's why I've been using the FBS and the FCS data, although I know a lot of folks out there choose not to use the FCS data for pretty obvious reasons. It just doesn't scale to FBS. When you're doing a team ranking, it's really hard to say that, the best FCS team is ranked, 131st or 132nd in comparison to the other FBS teams, because there's other, FBS teams that will lose to FCS teams. So they're not truly ranked at the bottom of the FBS ranking, in my opinion, which makes the modeling tricky, but we give it a go nonetheless here. So getting back into Penn State, they might actually have something here with the run game. It did not work well against Purdue, who's turned out to be a decent team this year, even though they lost to Syracuse by 3. Maybe a little bit of coaching was to blame for that, but they might have something in the run game, especially with Singleton. So I would look for them to try to take advantage of that this coming week. I think the run game was also maybe aided a bit by better play calling in the past few years. Penn State's had a couple This is going back maybe 6-7 years. A couple of offensive coordinators that had pretty questionable, if not downright repetitive, play calling on the offensive side of the ball, especially after the Barkley era. But I think they really kind of turned a corner this past week against Auburn and really brought their A game. So hopefully that will continue to move forward for them as they try to improve that run game that was quite bad last year statistically. And like I said before, turnovers last game really aided their score. The model is going to see that, as in the model is going to see that final score and see Penn State's offensive production as maybe a bit inflated compared to what it should be. So that's just one more thing to take into account into this coming week. So moving on to the Central Michigan side of things. It's really hard to gauge where this team's at, just in terms of, what a good versus decent performance is versus bad performance. Kind of like I talked about last week, 3 games in, it's kind of hard to say, I made the comparison last week, like when Auburn played San Jose State, was that a good game for them? Was that an average game? Was that a poor game for them? And I think we saw that was maybe a more or less, I hate to say it, but average game for them, especially when we saw them against Penn State this coming week. I'm not sure, even with an even turnover ratio, they don't lose by 7 or more, especially with their run scheme into what's a pretty good Penn State run defense. And even throwing the ball, they had some success early, but it definitely didn't get them the points they needed to win the game, let alone, keep it a 1-score game moving forward. As far as Central Michigan goes, looking back at the Oklahoma State game, we're going to focus on that more than the other games just because I think that offense has the most similarities to Penn State. In that game, we saw that they had 2 competent running backs, if not good running backs. I know they got a lot of yardage in garbage time, but Nichols, 2.8 average, but, had 72 yards, and then Bailey had 5.7 yards per carry. That's a good number. I'm not sure how much of that was aided in garbage time. It seems like a good bit of it was. And they are going to be facing a better run defense in Penn State than Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State can really sling the ball, and I think their offense is definitely more explosive than Penn State's, but I think with Sanders, you kind of have a guy similar to Clifford who can kind of do arguably everything a little bit better in terms of his legs and throwing the ball. It seemed like pass defense is what really burned Central Michigan in that game. And then the 44, I think, is a little bit of fool's gold, if you will, just because near the half was about 37-7. Oklahoma State put in the backups, and then from there, the gap closed a little bit. But I don't think that final score is a true representation of how close the game actually was. But nonetheless, they still had, Magogli, I hope I'm saying his name right, with over 126 yards in that game. Carey, who had 75 and some good plays, even against the starters for Oklahoma State. And I think those are the guys that are going to need to step up against this Penn State team. I've said before, they have projected first-round draft picks like Joey Porter Jr., but I'm not sold on their pass defense. We didn't get a great look at it last week. So I think if you're Central Michigan kind of moving into, how they could beat this Penn State game, I think, again, it's going to be through the air. I think, they have receivers who can do it. Richardson may not be an elite quarterback, but he's definitely decent. He had 8.7 yards per attempt against Oklahoma State, which isn't terrible. 4 T's, 1 interception. I think for the MAC, he's a good quarterback. I wouldn't expect this to be quite the blowout that, Penn State had against Oklahoma State, or Ohio University. Moving on from there, we're going to get into our model. So right now in Vegas, this game has a 25.5 point spread. The model right now is pretty darn close to that, saying Penn State 36.7, Central Michigan 10.1. And then I'm going to pick this game at 45-14. What makes modeling this game really tricky, as I alluded to in the start, is Bucknell is an FCS team, but they're also, quite frankly, a bad FCS team, actually ranked second worst. And so when the model sees 41-0, it actually numerically kind of dings, if you will, Central Michigan for that win. And I mean, in reality, Central Michigan, they could have put up more points in that game, but they're going to take out their starters, and they just don't need to score more points than 41. But the model doesn't take that into consideration. It sees 41-0 as a poor showing, essentially. And what I think is interesting with the model is it's really picking up on how good Penn State's defense is. Of course, I think those numbers are a little inflated, especially with Auburn only putting up 12 last week. That was really aided by turnovers. And then the other games, I mean, Purdue had some success, and then Ohio, who I think Central Michigan is a better team than, put up 10 as well. But I think, nonetheless, those numbers can't be overlooked. I think the spread is pretty much right on. I'm saying in the model here, it's a 26.6 point spread. And I think that's about right on if Penn State continues with the same quality of defense. My pick is going to be 45-14, and I don't think that isn't because I think Central Michigan is bad. I think that's just because Penn State is improving a ton on offense. I think with Singleton, they actually have a somewhat efficient rush game. And looking at the Oklahoma State game in particular for Central Michigan, it doesn't look like they have the tools on defense to stop the rush game or the pass game. They had a decent pass rush against, a decent front from Oklahoma State. I'm not sure they're any better than the O-line Penn State's going to field, though. And I definitely don't think the secondary is going to have much more luck, against Sanders and Clifford. I don't see a huge difference in the passing game from each of those. Penn State's got some decent receivers. They can hit some pass plays, and Central Michigan also struggled to contain Sanders, and we know Clifford's not going to shy away from running the ball as well. So I think when it comes down to it, Penn State's going to be able to score more or less when they want to. Central Michigan, I think they have the tools to, but I think the defense they're going to see is really not like any defense they've seen before. So I'm putting this at 45-14, largely because I think Penn State is getting better than the model thinks they are. And that's why I have them at 45 instead of 37. Meanwhile, for Central Michigan, they might surprise me. They have some real tools on offense. 14 seems low, but I really think that, this Penn State defense is kind of turning a corner. They're showing that they have, better scheme each game, week in and week out. Arguably, their competition's gotten a bit easier, and they've been aided by turnovers. But I really think this defense is for real. I don't see Michigan or Central Michigan having a ton of success with the rush. The model right now has them about 2.9 yards per carry, which isn't very good at all. That's not going to sustain drives. When we get in the passing, it looks like they'll be a little bit better. As I pull up that number right now, it looks like they might average about 6.5 passes per play. But this is also all assuming that, quite frankly, Bucknell is better than they are, which may or may not be a true assumption. So once again, like I said, I think the FCS adjustments, it makes this game hard to predict, but I think the spread from Vegas is right on. I think 25.5. I don't think it's a trap game, and I think Penn State is kind of figuring things out 3 games into the season, so that's why if I'm betting on this game, I would probably actually go above the spread, even though Central Michigan for years has been, and still are, one of the best teams in the MAC. They'll probably be favored to win it or have to be pretty close to it, I imagine. So that being said, my pick's 45-14, and I'm going to go above the spread. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe, and in the comments, please drop any other games you'd like me to run the model on. Thanks.